I've been sailing for 4 decades now, alone, mostly. I'd like to go out and just enjoy the ocean, as well as do a fair bit of fishing. I have a smaller boat for such things. Nothing fancy or huge, but big enough to get around and comfortable enough to sleep in during the short stints I would sleep. In all my years of boating around and sailing the Atlantic, I've never had an encounter quite like the one I found myself in during the trip I'm about to speak on. First off, being I sail alone, I generally don't sleep for very long. Depending where you're at and the precautions you make, you can sometimes get real sleep on the sea. But I always trained myself to sleep no longer than 2 hours at a time, as I've always been worried I'd wind up off course or worse. I'm familiar enough with the ocean, and I have comfortably slept here and there for 8-hour periods, but I had to make sure I was far out and alone as possible, and I did the prep work to be able to safely do so. That's a long story though, and I'm getting a bit sidetracked, so anyway, for the purposes of keeping my identity private, from henceforth just call me Dave. The ocean is a beautiful place, and in my opinion, it's a world all its own. Sail the seas long enough and you'll find out what I'm talking about. You'll find that when on land, you're itching to go back out again. For me, having done this sort of thing most of my life, it has gotten to the point that I consider the ocean my home. Life on land is alright, but there's nothing like the thrill and adventure of the unexpected. The ocean provides that in spades. On this occasion, I've been out at sea for about a week. It was late May in 2012, and I was fishing and relaxing. The days had been good to me, and I was grateful for another opportunity to be out on the ocean after taking some vacation time off work. The day went wonderfully, and the week was coming to an end. I would need to head back in a few days to make sure I got some time on land before heading back to work again. Night had fallen, and the forecast called for high winds, an unsettled ocean, and some rain. This is nothing I'm not used to handling, but I decided I'd try to make it through the night and the storm before attempting some sleep. Everything was calm till about 9 p.m., when the sun had completely set and the storm had come upon me. The waters were rough, and the storm certainly made its presence known to me. This didn't bother me in the slightest, and I was fully prepared to handle myself until I heard her voice. I lost my wife to brain cancer roughly 7 years prior to this event. She was the love of my life, and I'd been with her for over 30 years when she had passed. She used to go with me on my lengthy excursions out to the ocean. She was and is the only woman I could ever or will ever want in my life. The voice I heard was my wife's. I'm positive I was awake when this happened, and the first bolt of lightning, I swore, I saw her like you might see someone standing in the distance. She looked real, and she seemed to be trying to tell me something. I obviously was very perplexed, and I thought initially maybe sleep deprivation was getting to me. I remember refocusing and looking around me, only to realize the wind was picking up immensely. My radio was beginning to dip in and out, and my boat was beginning to be slammed. Keep in mind, as I said earlier, my vessel was nice and fully capable of handling the waters, but it's also smaller, and it was only now I realized the storm was much stronger than initially forecasted. I didn't panic, as the weather taking a sudden turn is fairly common. That said, I did try to radio out, and as I did, I got nothing. The next thing I knew, I looked up in time to see a fairly large surge of water hit my boat and knock me on my feet. I tried to turn the boat, but it was too late. Before I knew it, my boat was flipped and I was thrown into the ocean. I remember trying to get my head above water and popping out, taking a short breath before, bam, I was hit by another wave and dragged under. I fought with all of my might and fury, swimming to the surface again. Gasping for air, I looked up and I swear I saw my wife. I could faintly make out 2 words: keep swimming. I know how crazy this sounds, but on instinct, I trusted my wife's voice and I swam in her direction. I had no way of knowing for sure if this was really her or how it was even possible, but in my heart, something told me to keep swimming her way. I was hit with another blast of water from the ocean. Everything was backward. Up was down, down was up, and I truly felt like I was lost. Still, I pressed on, swimming with every bit of strength I had in me until I had time to catch my breath again. Looking out and gasping for air, I could see my wife once again. She wore the red dress she wore the night we had celebrated our 30th anniversary. I just remember focusing on her and not really thinking about anything else but trying to keep afloat. The truth is, reflecting back later, part of me did wonder, if I died there, would I be reunited with her? Still, in the moment, I was too focused on her image and survival to give up. I pressed forward and swam with all of my might. If it weren't for her guiding image and her voice, I'm sure I'd have completely lost everything and probably would have went under. I would have drowned or swum circles until I died. Thankfully, as I got closer to my wife, I felt a renewed vigor well up within me. It was because of her, and to this day I can't explain how, that I'm still alive. I swam in her direction for what felt like forever, and I'm sure it was at least an hour, until she faded. She faded before me within a few feet. She was close enough that I could reach, but upon trying to touch her, I only saw her sweet smile, and she faded. Instead of her skin, I felt the water, and just a few feet further, my boat was sitting upright and bobbing around in the ocean. I was able to reclaim my boat soon after, and the storm died down, not much longer after that. I'm not expecting anyone to believe me, but that night, I believe my life was saved by my late wife. I can't explain it. I didn't know if it was her ghost, my mind playing tricks on me, and using her image to keep me going, or something else, like some kind of weird survival trick, or if it was something else entirely, but to this day, that is the strangest and most dangerous trip I have ever taken to sea. The trip back home was uneventful. I never heard my wife's voice, saw her again, or ran into another storm or problem. I still boat today, but I wouldn't have if she hadn't been there with me that night. I won't pretend to know how or why it happened, but I'm thankful it did, and I hope when God finally decides it's my time, that she'll be waiting for me in the afterlife. My name is Jim, and I've seen all sorts of things out at sea while doing salvage work for my own private company. Salvage work involves not only boating into the ocean, but also exploring its depths in many cases. Usually for salvage from old boats or whatever our contract might ask for. You see a lot of long-term sunken ships and other interesting things. When you're really lucky, you may find treasure of a sort. I can't say I've come across treasure in the traditional sense that you see often overly glorified in Hollywood films. No, quite often, treasure comes in the form of salvaging a long-dead boat or recovering certain items thought to be lost in the seas. Sometimes it can be shipping containers, sometimes boats themselves, and other times strange oddities. I have a crew I work with, and as you can imagine, being we salvage everything from containers to whole boats and ships at times, I have a fairly large boat. My second in command, who we will call Eddie, does most of the diving. I navigate, and we have a crew of 6 or 7 guys whose names I will keep private for anonymity's sake. We've been at this gig for well over a decade, probably closing on 2, and in our time doing this we've seen a manner of strange things. Still, nothing has anything on this salvage. We were sent out in the Pacific to find a ship that had sunk a few months prior. The captain of the ship said strange things led to the sinking of the ship, and he claimed something strange was going on out there. Now, you have to understand, life on the sea can be exciting, but it can also be incredibly boring, and many a time you'll hear tall tales from captains or crews in any profession that revolves around being out in the ocean for any real amount of time. I often like to say, the longer the years as a captain on the sea, the taller the tales that will be spun by thee. Now, don't get me wrong. Strange things happen on the ocean, especially on longer trips, but quite often, truth is woven into a larger tale. I've never been one to spin tales, but I've always enjoyed hearing them, and this job had just the right air of spooky to make things that much more interesting. The captain of the ship we were looking for was certain this trip and his boat had been cursed after a run-in with an angry local a few weeks prior to leaving. I pried him about why he went his ship back then, but he would always get defensive and quiet, and only say he wanted to repair it if possible, not wanting to pry too much more as the contract was very unusually well paying. My crew and I set a week sail and accepted the contract, thinking this job would be an easy in and out and a wonderful payday. As luck would have it, things obviously didn't go according to plan. It was one of the strangest things I've ever experienced. The first days on the waters were unsettled. The weather forecast was clear skies and calm waters, but the trip toward this job was anything but. We had big winds, several thunderstorms, and completely erratic and unexplainable weather patterns. The storms were one thing. I have a large vessel, and so storms are something we can handle with ease, usually. Things grew stronger and stranger, though, as time went on. I and many of my crew would have very strange nightmares. In my nightmares, personally, I'd hear a loud calling. The seas were stormy, and something felt like it lurked in the distance. There would be lightning, and I'd see the faint outline of something in the storm. Every time I was about to witness what was out there, there would be a massive billowing thunder and the brightest flash of lightning. I'd be blinded and deafened before waking up in a cold sweat and heading back on deck. I had a talk with Eddie, who explained something similar in his nightmares. We thought this strange and brought this to the attention of the rest of the crew, who all had similar stories. This was frightful, but I believed we'd all be fine, and we made a decision as a crew to continue toward the salvage. I personally felt the nightmares would make for an interesting share when we got to the shore, and also these nightly oddities only strengthened my interest in our contract. I will admit, after the first week on the waters, I began to believe there might be something to what the captain was saying. I wasn't sure why, how, nor did I entirely overthink it, but at the very least the events were strange. Our second week out, the waters were relatively calm though. The nightmares were still being had and shared. They'd always end the same way, and I'd always awake with irrational fear. The closer we got to the area where our client's ship sank, the more fear I felt welling up within me. It wasn't just me either. My crew began to get a lot shakier and seemed more on edge. A few even claimed they were having trouble sleeping, and one almost sleepwalked off the ship entirely. Thankfully, Eddie was on watch that night and was able to spot him and reach him before he made it over the edge. I, once again, partially out of kindness and partially because I was starting to second-guess myself, put continuing the job up to a vote. The votes were split more this time, but ultimately we came to the conclusion that we had come too far at this point to stop. There was also the fact that many of us were relying on this salvage's bounty for rent, bills, and all those lovely responsibilities that came with being an adult. Plus, we'd be making enough to split a healthy chunk in savings, maybe even be able to put a vacation on if we wanted to. So, we continued forward. It was the end of the second week on the water that we arrived at the coordinates where the vessel was said to have sunk. The first day of searching, we didn't find the ship. This wasn't too unusual, and we had continued our search. We figured that maybe the waters had moved it a ways, or maybe our client didn't have the exact area as his ship sank after all. I remember the first night of the search vividly. I awoke with a stir and panic so strong I thought I was having a panic attack or a heart attack at first. I wasn't alone in this feeling, as Eddie began to complain of his nightmares as well. My crew was restless, and some even claimed they were beginning to see strange things in the water at night, or even in the distance. It was too late to turn back now, without our salvage, and so we stayed and endured it. One night turned into two into 4, and before we knew it, we were almost a month out at sea. By this point, one of my men was forced to be kept under watch as he tried to harm himself one night after running onto the deck, trying to tie a crate to himself and attempting to throw himself overboard. We caught him and kept him in one of the lower holds. I had told someone watching him at all times that they would have to be very careful. He would often sleep and mumble things so we didn't understand under his breath. Almost a month and a week later, we came upon a big storm. The storm wasn't forecast. Again, the weather wasn't acting naturally. I remember this all too well because as Eddie dove, he reported finding the salvage. I obviously told him to come up as the waters were going to be uneasy soon, and sure enough, that night, we spent inside the ship keeping close watch on things. I remember a dread coming over us as we felt the ship rocking and listened in the distance. At one point I heard something outside the captain's quarters, which I'd been keeping watch on things from. There was a loud knocking. I remember there were 4 distinct knocks followed by a loud grinding sound on the other side of the door. I called out to the crew, asking for a meeting in the galley. We all came together and I asked them very sternly, making sure to keep eye contact with each of the men, about the noises at my door. I know my men and I know when they're lying. My crew was at a loss. They all claimed to never have come near my quarters and I believe them. They then came to me about their own odd experiences. Strange sounds at night, things moving, small things, and like creepy things. But things were also getting more intense. It started with small things being moved at first, but then it moved to larger things. Eddie and a few others mentioned hearing scurrying about late at night while on watch. Some of them described things similar to the noises at their own doors. The nightmares had continued to plague us all as well. I don't doubt we were all thinking about leaving in that moment, but we'd finally found the salvage, and we also thought if we wait a night, we might just find we'd come on the other side of the storm fine, with the salvage in tow and be able to head to friendlier waters. I told the crew to try to get some sleep, what little they could, and once the storm passed and day broke again, we'd get the ship ready and head back with our salvage in tow. Later that night, I heard an all too familiar calling. It was a thundering so loud that it shook the boat and almost sounded like a loud trumpet. I shot out of bed, and I rushed out of my quarters. I stumbled as I felt something massive hit the bottom of the boat. I stood up and went above deck, watching in the distance as the rain pelted me. Eddie was pointing in the distance in shock. Did you hear that?" he screamed over the storm. I nodded and asked him what he thought it might be. He shook his head and said he didn't have a clue. I asked him if he felt something hit the boat, and before he could answer, there was another massive boom of thunder followed by an all too familiar blinding lightning. I covered my eyes and fell to the deck. There was another immense shifting as yet again it felt like our ship was hit by something. I looked in the distance and had this eerie sense something was out there. I knew this was irrational, but nothing about this trip had seemed very rational or sane for that matter. I grabbed Eddie and we headed back below deck, waiting out the storm in our own quarters. I told my men, no one is going above deck until the storm had passed without my explicit permission or an emergency of some kind. I made sure I drilled my point home and spent the rest of the night in my quarters. I don't know how to explain it, but I felt like there was something on the horizon. It felt huge. I never saw anything, as I never went above deck until the storm had passed. I eventually passed out, and when I woke up in the morning, there was a loud banging on my door. I opened up the door and saw Eddie, who informed me he'd been banging on the door for some time, and wanted to make sure I was still okay, as well as inform me the storm had passed. I told him I passed out, and soon after that we wasted no time getting our salvage in tow and hightailing it back to the California coastline. We experienced nightmares the entire journey home, but they grew less intense the closer we got there. We eventually met up with our client and returned the boat to him. We were paid, and strangely upon reaching and loading the boat, were never bothered by any sort of hallucinations, nightmares, or psychosis of any kind since. Stranger still, the man I told of on my crew who almost committed suicide was fine and far more rational after the fact. I told him he needed to see someone regardless, and we watched him for some time after. We've been on many jobs since, and I've never had any experiences like that. I'm not sure what to say other than I'm glad that we are done with that job, and I'm a lot more wary about details and contracts now. My entire crew still sails with me, and the man who experienced the mental breakdown is fine now. His therapist believed it was stress-induced, and while I believe that was part of it as well, I also believe there was more to it. I share this story to tell you I'm a firm believer in the fact that there are truly unexplainable things on and in the waters. I've never been more assured since that salvage job. So if you are out in the waters of the Pacific Ocean, or on the ocean for any real amount of time, be wary and be careful. Life on the ocean is beautiful and wonderful, as well as hard. That said, there are things that lurk in the ocean no one can explain naturally. I'm a 32-year-old female who spends much of my free time scuba diving in the Gulf of Mexico. I was on vacation last year when I came upon something I can't explain. To clear up any confusion before we begin, I dive quite a bit. It's something I've been doing for the better part of the last decade. I'm quite experienced, and this wasn't my first time in the Gulf. I've seen a manner of sea creatures while diving, but I've never seen whatever I saw during this dive before or since this dive. So the day was very calm. The waters were the perfect temperature, and all in all, up to this point, the trip had been a relaxing time. I got in my scuba gear and prepped myself prior to diving. While under the water, things were really nice. I remember looking at all the manner of sea life and just enjoying the dive. At about 100 feet down, I noticed a dark spot in the water. I'm not talking oil or anything like that. I'm talking a spot that I initially assumed might be a fish or some kind of thing like that. Before I got closer and realized it was much larger than any fish I had ever come upon or heard of. I was about 120 feet away when I saw this motionless black mass just floating in the water. My first thought maybe it was some debris of some kind. That thought quickly left as I got closer. This thing was the size of a ship and seemed to have an almost round shape. The thing I saw was long and round, almost oval in its form. It had black skin. I'm talking it almost looked like a massive shadow. I reached out to touch this thing out of curiosity, and when I did, these strange holes opened up on its body, and what looked like little eyes appear. I remember freaking out as much as I possibly could. These larger eyes had suddenly appeared to open up as well. I don't know if the other holes were eyes or what they were. Visibility wasn't the best, but the big opening was certainly an eye. It was huge. I remember being paralyzed with fear. I could feel my breathing increasing and my heart rate beginning to spike. I felt this panic just at the sheer size of this creature. It sank into me, and I was terrified. I could feel my breathing increasing and my heart rate beginning to spike once more. I felt a drop in the ocean temperature as the thing seemed to gaze at me. I say seemed, as its pupil seemed to look black. This thing soon shut its eye and the holes, or eyes, or whatever openings were all over its body. Then it just seemed to disappear. I don't think it actually disappeared though. I think it was a camouflage of some sort. I then felt a shift, and this sudden feeling like I was being pulled slowly forward. I freaked out and attempted to swim upward, but felt myself sinking. There was another shift and a brief moment where I stopped being pulled before I was then shot upward until the water settled, and at that point, I knew whatever I had seen had dove too deep for me to see. I calmed myself and took the swim back up slowly. The rest of the trip was fairly relaxed, but I couldn't get this thing out of my mind. I didn't have a camera on me, and even if I did, I'm not sure if it would have helped. I have no idea what this thing could be or what it was. I still remember the terror that gripped me at the time, but I partly feel as though the reason I felt this way was that I was experiencing something unknown to me while diving. I've tried looking up what this might be, or if anyone has experienced anything like it while diving in the Gulf or anywhere out there for that matter. I haven't really found anything to go off of though. So, because of this, I'll leave this question to you all. Have you ever experienced this, or something equally strange while diving? I've been a fisherman all of my adult life. That's over 30 years of fishing. Sometimes, though, I'd like to take some time away and fish for the sake of fishing. The following story is about such a time when I went fishing in the Bermuda Triangle. No doubt you've heard plenty of theories and mysteries on the area and why boats, planes, and all manner of things go missing there. Everything from air bombs to mysterious sea creatures to other unexplainable phenomena has been theorized and proclaimed as the reason that so many go missing in those waters. Well, I'm not claiming to know the answer, but I do have a tale about a time I tried fishing there myself, and the strange things I witnessed while out there. To start, you should know I only planned to be out there a few days initially. I'd sailed the waters before and nothing crazy had happened. So, I figured this spot was as safe as any to sail and fish again. I set out on a Friday morning in July, I believe was 2013. Maybe a year off or two as I'm older and my memory isn't too great. So I'm putting along when I notice some clouds in the distance. I think I'd better double check the forecast, and as I do so, I realize the weather seems fine. I keep an eye out and do some fishing. Things seem to be going nicely, and I'm catching myself some fair-sized fish. A few hours go by and I take a break. I have a beer, one beer to clarify, and I doze off. I awake to smack in the middle of a face from a fish and the sound of what I thought might be rain. I awake to a smack in the face from a fish and the sound of what I thought might be rain. But I quickly realize it's more fish leaping from the water and hitting the boat. I'm weirded out, but as I wake up more and start looking around, I notice the strange layer of what looks like black clouds in the sky. This cloud formation look pitch black and a fair bit nasty. I try to check the radio, and realizing it isn't getting any power. I'm not talking it's playing static, I mean it appears to be dead. This obviously makes no sense, but neither does the fish that seem to be leaping at me and trying to get into my boat. I take some binoculars and look at the horizon. This cloud formation seems to be getting closer, but I'm not noticing any wind. I'm a bit weirded out, so I look up at the formation itself. I see no rain, no lightning, only a disturbingly eerie stillness. By this point, the fish have stopped jumping at my boat. The waters are still, as the mysterious formation reaches the sun, and the sky turns an eerie color. It was like night, but I describe it as darker. I turn on a searchlight on my boat and pan around the water. I'm not sure how to explain to you why this was so unnerving, but I felt like I wanted to jump out of my skin. It wasn't the pitch black sky or the strange events that had occurred prior. No, it was the stillness of the ocean. There was an almost suffocating silence. I've never known silence to be oppressive, but believe me, this was oppressive. To add to the strange nature of the events before me, my searchlight is older and usually grinds a bit or squeaks when I move it. I moved my light and there wasn't a sound. I tried screaming and I swear I heard nothing. It was as if everything was covered by this cloud formation, was placed in a soundproof room. I remember shaking and freaking out. I pointed my searchlight to what I believed to be clouds above me only to find my light die and a hole open in the center of the formation. It was at this point I realized I couldn't even hear the ocean. There was no sound and an eerie red glow now permeating from the center of the clouds above. Looking around, the glow made the sky seem red, though I knew it couldn't have been. I looked up and noticed the red fade and the hole disappear. Everything was dark as my searchlight slowly flickered on again. Suddenly, this formation of clouds seemed to shoot forward into the sky silently and with a speed unimaginable. 1 second it was pitch black and there was no sound, and the next the sound had returned and the sky was clear. I can't even begin to fathom what or whatever I saw might be. I can say that I know it wasn't a cloud formation. I sat down in shock for a bit. I was soon brought out of it when my boat radio sparkled to life about clear skies expected in the area. I took the fish in my boat and threw them back into the water. Shakily, I'm still baffled and terrified of the events that I went through that day. Needless to say, once I was sure the coast was clear, I turned my boat around and headed home. I haven't fished those waters ever since, and I don't plan on ever going back. I have had time to reflect on these events, and the only thing I can think of was possibly being some sort of UFO. I don't know of any similar stories to this, but what else could this have been? If ever there was a terrible place to live, this village between the mountains has to rank as one of the absolute worst. I've been here working on the police force for years now, and believe me when I say that I wish I could leave. It's not so easy. Just like a plague, this town's weird. Rotten energy has to be contained, and it takes all of us to do so. And that's the only reason I'm saying anything, to keep everyone else away. I won't tell you the exact location of the town, but I'll tell you how to recognize that you found yourself near it. You'll be traveling in the mountains, through winding paths with lots of trees. There won't be a building for miles and your radio might not work so well. But at one point or another, you may hear a little crackle if you tune into a specific channel. 104.6 FM is the only radio station you can get in this area, and you may want to listen in while you're driving in the case that there is something more urgent than you think. However, if all you hear is some crackling music and the voices of either our two bickering announcers, the next thing you'll see on your journey is a tiny rest stop with only one gas pump. You can stop and top off your tank if you like, but don't bother going inside for anything other than to drop off a handful of cash. There's almost never anyone there, and when there is, they won't help you any. The plumbing doesn't work. The old man at the desk will just tell you to piss in the woods, and all the food on the shelves is probably teeming with some kind of fungus. At this point, you'll want to get back in your car, make sure you have enough fuel for the trip, and go back in whichever direction you came from. I knew this area was bad news a long time ago, but it wasn't until recently that I started working forest duty that I knew just how much I hated it. Things just aren't normal out here. Everyone who considers themselves a local knows this, but they don't all know why. All they know for sure are these three things. 1. Going into the woods, no matter what time of day, is a bad idea. 2. When something weird happens, you learn to turn your head and don't ask questions. 3. Always listen for the emergency fog broadcast. By the time you see it with your own eyes, it'll be too late. What I'm going to say is going to sound like the ramblings of a madman, but I'm telling you exactly what was told to me when I joined the force. Where the old watchtower sits, at the point where the village ends and the mountainous forests begin, the tree line is a barrier between a vicious, feral world and our own. The forest is alive, like some sort of twisted miracle. Anything dead that touches its soil, the grass or the bark of the trees, all become part of a grotesque collection. It sounds like zombie apocalypse stories, but I assure you, it's not. Nothing in there feeds off flesh or blood or anything like that. A colleague of mine once told me they just want to grow. Some have called us in hysterics to report animals lumbering towards them with mismatched human features and vice versa. Others have reported something more terrifying. I believe one of the emergency broadcasters at the watchtower, I think her name starts with an E, but the police chief calls her 28, saw this thing we all dread the most. It's old, but it's not some god or deity or ruler of the forest. It's simply the strongest, amassing more parts and more weight than any of the rest. Few have seen more than a giant antler through the trees or a glimpse of a long, thin claw, but we know it's out there. I'd like to tell you that we're looking for a way to bring it down before it collects even more, but for now, the most we can do is control the swarm. If you haven't already guessed, our local radio station is more of a defense than a means of entertainment. I'll tell you my name if it means anything. It's Finn. Officer Finn. I'll leave it up to your imagination whether that's my first or my last name. Not long ago, I accompanied a fellow police officer on the search for a missing woman after her severed fingers were found at the watchtower outside the village, and that was the beginning of my experience with dreaded forest duty. Instead of boring you with all the details of countless unbelievable anecdotes, I'll give you a short rundown of the strangest cases myself and my colleagues have handled in the past few months alone. January. White male, mid-40s, called to tell us that his aging, senile mother was trying to coax animals from the woods into her home because she mistook them for her late husband. Upon a quick inspection of the old burial plot near the woods, her husband's remains had been dug up and still have not been recovered. The ground was still frozen and no shovel marks were seen. February. Black female, 16 years old, called the police after saying a man with roots where his face should have been was trying to lure her into the woods. When asked what he said, she told us he didn't say anything. The roots took over his mouth, but I felt him asking me to follow. Oddly, her story lines up with the last 11 reports in the last 3 years, all of them from children and teens. March. White female, mid-20s, supposedly attempted suicide in a bathtub. After being resuscitated, she slurred something about her father's voice being stolen by a mountain lion. Later, when questioned, she denied remembering a single thing that she said and claimed she had never attempted to drown herself at all. Blood alcohol levels were suspiciously high. April. Hispanic male, 30 years old. Both eardrums ruptured violently by a mechanical mishap involving an audio headset while at his workplace. While in recovery, an elderly woman called the police station from an anonymous number to simply say God gave him what he needed, deaf ears to better see his glory. Her identity is unknown. May. In the span of 1 week, 4 individuals went missing in the exact same location. Jennifer Cook, age 25, Pamela and Gordon Richmond, ages 48 and 52, Marcus Bain, age 27. The only evidence left behind were 4 of Jennifer's fingers, 1/2 of Mr. and Mrs. Richmond's corpses, and a box of old rotten groceries left on the ground where Marcus disappeared. None of his remains have been recovered, but as you can imagine, no one expects to find him alive. So I had said I was working on a case of a missing woman. That missing woman was Jennifer Cook. For the first few hours, we were looking for her in one piece, and after that, we started looking for her body instead. Unfortunately, it still hasn't been found, though it has been seen, which tells us that there's little hope in recovering her as she used to be. My fellow officer, whom I will call Nancy for the time being, was extraordinarily gung-ho when it came to uncovering Jennifer's whereabouts. She was new, even more fresh than I was, but had been transferred about over a decade of duty on the side of the state. I think this is the reason why she was so dedicated to considering this a murder case and not a recovery mission instead. She yet to really understand how little of this place follows the rules and what we consider normal. I always get lightheaded out here. I hate the mountains, I complained, as we marched up through the tree-covered hills, a canine on alert walking in front of us. Right? Nancy agreed with me. Almost like you can tell if you're going up or down sometimes. It's no wonder people get lost out here and end up not finding their way back. She didn't know the half of it. Doesn't explain how Jennifer ended up shoved up in a tree, though. Nancy had a heavy furrowed brow as she continued. She didn't need to show that kind of angry intimidation just to talk to me, but I started to work out that it might just be her face. I think it's weird, that's all. Out here, away from town, where we're told to encourage people to stay away, it's like someone's hiding something out here. What do you think they're hiding? I asked, genuinely curious. I don't know, Finn. She shrugged, eyes peering up to scan the trees around us. It was too silent. Not even a single bird chirped to be heard. But someone's out here killing people and no one seems to be interested in hunting them down. She had a hoarse, dry whisper as she narrowed her eyes, and I regret to admit that I almost laughed. I was reminded so much of the old sheriffs from Western movies, always ready to draw both pistols in preparation for some scoundrel sneaking up on them. I wasn't about to tell a fellow officer, especially not one with years more experience than I had, that she looked a little bit like Yosemite Sam. Oh, motherfuck! We both heard of a medical personnel shout before we saw anything. Our canine perked up his ears, but didn't seem to sense a threat. Rather, we found ourselves pulled further into the bushes, where sets of footprints added to what appeared to already be pushed down path of flattened twigs and grass. It looked like something had been dragged, and once we could see what the others had seen, we had a good clue of what pulled through there. At first, it looked like one body. In fact, it was two. A man's upper half and a woman's lower half. Both of them likely dead for no more than 24 hours at most. As for the other half of them, well, it appeared they were gone. We recognized the man's face. It was Gordon Richmond from town, and our only guess was that the other was his wife who had gone missing with him during a heavy bout of fog. These goddamn broadcast employees are not doing their job. Shit, where's the rest of them? I looked over at Nancy, who seemed bothered but not clearly as disturbed by the revelation as I was. Either the couple had been partially devoured or the forest was getting smart by splitting up pieces, making it harder for us to find them. Nancy shook her head in disgust. I told you, didn't I? Some sick fuck is out here just playing with us. Oh god, it reeks out here. One of the paramedics had to cover his face with his sleeve. It was pretty bad when someone who routinely worked with all the terrible smells the human body could create was sickened by standing 10 feet away from it. But I had to agree. From where I stood, the bodies smelled as if they had been rotting for weeks, covered in mold and stuffed with hot garbage that had been soaked in pig waste. It was that bad. We took photos of the scene, including shots of the surrounding area for any relevance of broken branches or additional evidence. Not far from the bodies, Nancy happened upon a cell phone sitting at the foot of a tree, and in the process we found another source of that terrible smell. The tree was dripping with what looked like sap against the dark-colored bark, but we were so wrong about that. It was blood. Dark, thick blood practically rolled out of the tree from a hole in the bark center, as if it had been filled to capacity and was forming a puddle in the grass beneath. What the hell is that? She squinted at the tree, gloved hands holding the cell phone carefully before she inspected the screen. There's something wrong with the tree, but first, we've got another problem here. What's the problem? I asked, and she turned the cell phone towards me to show the last message on the screen. Missed calls from the same person, and it was a name we both recognized. Evelyn. That's right. That's what her name was. That was 28 up at the broadcast tower. We'd have to run the phone number later, but in a village of only a few hundred people, it wasn't difficult to make an assumption here. It was a problem, but not for the reason Nancy thought. You see, she was suspicious, almost immediately, that the radio employee had something to do with this. seeing as the two working at the outpost had constant access to the surrounding forested area. Me, however, I was more worried that it meant our new broadcasters had been snooping around in the woods. We really could not afford to lose more after losing 27 already, even if those were a couple of incompetent slackers. Before we could continue the conversation of what to do with that information, I heard another sound of disgust from one of the paramedics. The two of them had been attempting to move the male's upper body onto a cloth hammock for transportation, but couldn't get him off the ground. Nancy and I abandoned the still bleeding tree to see what was holding him down. It was more unnerving and grotesque than we could have imagined. They managed to pull him 1.5 feet off the ground before dropping him onto his side, where we saw that his body was being invaded by roots underneath him. They were growing straight through his chest cavity, wrapping around all of his insides and keeping him stuck to the ground until a heavy tug jarred him partially loose. The smell that hit the air was almost too much for any of us, and I had to stagger away to keep from losing my breakfast. I felt my mouth water, but choked back the urge to vomit. "It looks like something's growing through," one of the paramedics gagged, turning her back but unable to escape the smell. I covered my nose and mouth with my sleeve and crouched down, happy that I was wearing gloves as I took a closer look. Nancy was right beside me, and what we saw next may have been her true initiation into our little branch of Crazy Town police force. Gordon's body, dead and drained of his blood, suddenly moved in a series of twitches as an unearthly groan left his mouth. When he parted his lips, stretching his jaw wide, we could see the twists and curls of branches moving around inside of his throat. They were wiggling on the ground as well, as if inching further into his torso to take a tighter grip. All at once, the roots pulled onto him and jammed him back flat against the ground where he was before, sinking deeper into the soil as if planting him back in place. His eyes were opened and wide, white with blue veins pale in the surface, as he made one last agonizing croak. We would have thought his body was making some sort of automatic response, like the breath of some mortician's report from corpses after releasing some gas from their lungs. Only, that didn't explain his next trick. He blinked his eyes and they rolled back forward, faded irises moving from side to side before they focused directly on everyone, one at a time. He looked at me, then he looked at Nancy, and then... blam! Before Gordon's corpse could make another sound, Nancy had pulled out her gun from its holster and shot it straight between the eyes point blank. It was a panic response, but still, we would be getting in a world of trouble for this regardless. Did you have to do that? I shouted at her, as if her split-second response ignited my own moment of panic. One of the paramedics was clutching his chest. The other simply looked happy to be standing further away. "You fucked up his face." "As if it wasn't already?" Nancy no longer sounded assertive or full of aggression. She just sounded confused, scared, and trying to put herself back together. "What the hell did we just see?" While she was catching her breath, probably trying to figure out what she had just seen with her own two eyes, I dug around for a pocket knife to pass to one of the paramedics. They were putting him in a sling, so they could be the ones to cut him out of the roots. I tried to distance myself while they did, in part because of the smell and in part because the roots screamed as they were cut. We were about to leave, taking our evidence back with a plan to have a few words with our broadcast worker who had shown up on Jennifer's abandoned cell phone. Before we had the chance, however, our canine suddenly began to make the most low, guttural growling noise I had ever heard from him. I felt a tug on his leash and saw him pointing his nose towards a thick patch of trees and bushes, seemingly looking at nothing. All of the hair on his back bristled, and he bared his teeth at the dark space underneath the pines. I swore, for a split second there, I might have heard something growl back. That, and the momentary glimmer of something shining between the sparsely visible spot between the branches. A pair of eyes. No, not a pair. A trio at least. The dog tucked his tail and backed up, and that's when we knew it was time for us to leave. I won't bother trying to speculate what our canine saw that we didn't see. The reason for that is, it could have been anything. In my time here, I've learned two very distinct things working on the force. You never know what you might come across, and you'll never, ever be prepared for it. The case of Jennifer Cook is still open, or at least that's what we're telling her family for now. As far as we're concerned, she's been added to the endless list of anomalies in the forest that will have to be contained. In the meantime, I've been trying to get a hold of that guy up in the radio tower, Dan, whatever his last name is. They'll need someone to take over their supply deliveries. As you can imagine, none of the teens working at the local grocery store are stupid enough to volunteer. If Dan won't come outside to get their shit, Nancy and I may be pulling straws to see who gets put as long-term forest duty. All I can say for now is that this place is unnatural. It's a mess of impossible things made possible, but none of the things we'd like to see. It's a nightmare on the worst days and radiates unease on its best. So if you're driving by on a mountain pass looking for something to listen to, and you catch the crackling of 104.6, I suggest you don't go any further. We don't need the woods to grow anymore.